My mom protected my sister, a liar, and then wanted to give up on me. Looking back, I don't know why I ever thought things would be different. Maybe it was the hope that every child carries, the belief that one day, if they try hard enough, they'll finally be seen. But some things never change, no matter how much you wish they would. From the outside, our family looked perfect. A hard-working single mother, 2 daughters, a modest but well-kept home. My mother played her role well, the struggling but devoted parent, the woman who did everything for her children. People admired her strength. They believed the stories she told about her sacrifices. But inside those walls, the truth was something else entirely. My sister, Emma, was everything my mother wanted in a daughter. She was beautiful, charming, and effortlessly likable. Wherever she went, she drew people in, making them trust her, adore her. She was the kind of person who could do something cruel and still have everyone around her believe she was the victim. And she knew it. I was nothing like her. I was quiet, awkward, and always a step behind. While Emma filled rooms with laughter, I faded into the background. While she thrived in the warmth of my mother's attention, I learned to live without it. Emma could do no wrong. If something broke, I was the one who had done it. If she failed, it was because I had distracted her. If money went missing, I was the thief. No matter how many times it happened, no matter how unfair it was, my mother never questioned it. She never doubted Emma's word. She never even considered that maybe, just once, I was telling the truth. At first, I fought against it. I tried to explain, to defend myself, to make her see that Emma was lying. But the more I fought, the angrier my mother became. In her eyes, I wasn't just guilty, I was ungrateful. I was difficult. I was a problem. So eventually, I stopped fighting. It was easier that way. I learned to take the blame, to nod when accused, to stay quiet even when it burned inside me. What was the point in arguing when the verdict had already been decided? But no matter how much I tried to stay out of trouble, it always found me. The night everything changed, I came home to find my mother waiting in the living room. Her purse was open on the table, emptied. Emma sat nearby, her eyes red, her shoulders hunched as if she had been crying. It didn't take long to understand what had happened. The money was gone. Emma had taken it. But she wasn't going to admit that. She never did. And as always, my mother didn't ask any questions. She didn't wonder if there was another explanation. She had already made up her mind. It had to be me. There was no point in arguing. I had done it so many times before, and it never changed anything. No matter what I said, no matter how certain I was that Emma was lying, my mother would only hear what she wanted to hear. But this time, something inside me felt different. For years, I had believed that if I just tried harder, if I just proved myself, my mother would finally love me the way she loved Emma. I told myself that one day, she would see the truth. That one day, things would be fair. That night, I realized the truth. That day was never coming. I wasn't her daughter. Not really. I was just an inconvenience, something she had to deal with. If I disappeared, nothing in her life would change. And that was when I knew I had to leave. I had spent my entire life trying to belong to a family that never wanted me. It was time to stop. Leaving wasn't something I had planned. I didn't have a secret escape fund, no place to run to, no plan beyond the realization that I couldn't stay. But that night, standing in that living room, watching my mother look at me with the same exhausted disappointment she always did, I knew I had reached the end. The weight of years of blame, of being the convenient scapegoat, of knowing that no matter what I did, I would always be second to Emma, it was suffocating. And I was tired. I went to my room and packed the few things that mattered. Not much, just enough to fit in a single bag. Clothes, a book I had read a dozen times, a notebook I sometimes wrote in, and the little money I had managed to save from odd jobs. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one came after me when I walked out. Not Emma, who had already moved on from her latest lie. Not my mother, who had probably convinced herself that she was better off without me. Maybe she even thought she was teaching me a lesson, that I'd come crawling back, apologizing for something I hadn't done. But I didn't look back. The first night was the hardest. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. The thought of asking a friend for help made my stomach twist. Most of them only tolerated me because of Emma. The idea of telling them the truth, of admitting that my own mother had turned her back on me, was too much to bear. So I wandered. I walked through streets that felt unfamiliar at night, passing by glowing windows where other families sat together, warm and safe, while I shivered on the outside. I spent the night in a park, curled up on a bench, my bag hugged against my chest. The cold seeped through my clothes, but it was nothing compared to the hollow feeling inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit it. I had never been wanted. Maybe my mother had tried, in her own way, in the beginning. Maybe when I was a baby, before Emma learned how to twist reality, my mother had held me and loved me. But somewhere along the way, that love had faded. Maybe it had never been real at all. The world outside was harsh, but at least it was honest. At least here, the rules were clear. There was no one pretending to love me only to rip it away whenever it was convenient. I spent the next few days figuring out how to survive. I found a shelter that let me sleep on a cot in a crowded room full of people who had stories worse than mine. I ate cheap meals that barely filled me, but they were better than nothing. And slowly, I started to see something I had never seen before. Freedom. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next accusation. I wasn't dreading the sound of my mother's voice calling my name, knowing it would only be to blame me for something I hadn't done. I wasn't walking on eggshells, trying to avoid Emma's traps, knowing that no matter what happened, I would be the one to take the fall. I had nothing. No family, no home, no security. But at least now, I had myself. And that was something. The first few weeks on my own were the hardest. I had no experience in taking care of myself, no idea how to find a job, no real plan beyond making it to the next day. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at my stomach as I stretched every bit of money I had. I learned which stores wouldn't chase you off for lingering too long, which cafes had free refills on hot water so I could pretend I was drinking tea. The shelter where I had spent my first nights was overcrowded, and beds weren't always guaranteed. Some nights I got lucky. Others, I ended up back on a park bench or in a 24-hour laundromat, trying to stay warm. It was a harsh existence, but at least it was mine. Eventually, I found small ways to earn money. A diner down the street from the shelter let me wash dishes under the table for cash. It wasn't much, barely enough for a meal and a place to sleep when I couldn't get into the shelter, but it was better than nothing. It was there, scrubbing grease off plates in the back of a noisy kitchen, that I started to feel something I had never felt before: independence. No one was blaming me for things I hadn't done. No one was twisting my words or making me feel like I was the problem. The work was hard, exhausting, and thankless, but at least when I earned my money, it was mine. I spent my days looking for more work and my nights either at the shelter or in the diner storage room when the manager let me crash there. Slowly, I started piecing things together. I bought a second-hand coat from a thrift store, something warm enough to get me through the colder nights. I saved up enough for a cheap flip phone so I could at least make calls if I needed to. For the first time, I had control over my own life. But with that freedom came the weight of loneliness. There were moments, late at night, when exhaustion settled deep in my bones, and I wondered if I had made the wrong choice. Not because I wanted to go back. I didn't. But because it was hard. so much harder than I had ever imagined. I had spent my entire life waiting for my mother to love me the way she loved Emma. And now that I was gone, I realized how foolish that hope had been. If she had cared, she would have stopped me. She would have come looking for me. She would have missed me. But she didn't. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing. No messages. No calls. It was like I had never existed. I had always known Emma was the favorite, but some part of me had believed my mother loved me in her own way. That even if she didn't show it, there was something in her heart that still held on to me. Now I knew the truth. I was disposable. Maybe I had always been. Survival had become my routine, but I knew I couldn't live that way forever. Scraping by with odd jobs and sleeping wherever I could find a place wasn't a life. It was just existing. And despite everything, I wanted more than that. The real change started with a woman named Linda. She worked at the diner where I washed dishes, a server in her 50s with tired eyes, but a kind voice. She never pried, never asked why I looked exhausted or why I never talked about my family. But one evening, after a long shift, she slipped an extra plate of food in front of me. She said nothing, just gave me a look that told me she knew more than I had let on. That moment stuck with me. I had spent so long believing that people were only kind when they wanted something, that love was conditional, that help came with a cost. But Linda expected nothing in return. She just saw a girl trying to survive, and decided to help in the smallest way she could. It was because of her that I finally asked about something more permanent. She knew someone who needed a part-time cleaner at a small motel down the street. It wasn't much, just a few hours a day, but it was something. With that job, I was able to rent a tiny room in a shared boarding house. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were thin, and the mattress was lumpy, but it was mine. That was the first real shift. Once I had an address, things became easier. I could apply for real jobs instead of under-the-table work. I got a position as a cashier at a grocery store, which paid just enough to cover rent and food. I finally had a routine, a schedule, a place to sleep every night that wasn't a shelter or a diner storage room. But more importantly, I started to believe in myself. For so long, I had been defined by my mother's disappointment and my sister's lies. I had spent years thinking I was the problem, that I wasn't enough, that I would always be second best. But when I stripped away their voices, when I stopped looking at myself through their eyes, I started to see the truth. I wasn't weak. I wasn't useless. I had built a life from nothing. I had survived on my own. And now, I was doing more than surviving. I was finally living. There were still bad days. Nights when the loneliness crept in, when I wondered what my life might have been if I had been born into a different family. There were moments when I caught myself waiting for my mother to call, for Emma to admit the truth, for someone to say, "I'm sorry for what we did to you." But those moments became fewer and farther between. Because, for the first time in my life, I didn't need them anymore. Time moved forward, and so did I. The days of sleeping on benches, of washing dishes for scraps, of waiting for love that would never come, all of it felt like another life. I had a job, a place to call my own, and most importantly, a sense of control over my own fate. But the past has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. It had been over a year since I had walked out of my mother's house, when I saw her number flash on my phone screen. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath caught somewhere between shock and resentment. She hadn't called me once after I left, not even to check if I was still alive. And now, out of nowhere, she wanted to talk. I didn't answer. Instead, I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a message popped up. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed play. Her voice was exactly as I remembered, calm, controlled, as if she had already decided how this conversation was going to go. She didn't ask where I was or how I had been. Instead, she told me that Emma had been caught stealing from a friend's family. Not a few dollars this time, but thousands. And this time, there was no one else to take the blame. I should have felt vindicated, but all I felt was exhaustion. My mother didn't call because she missed me. She didn't call because she had realized she was wrong. She called because she needed something. Maybe she wanted me to come back, to be the good daughter, to fix things like I had always been expected to. Maybe she wanted me to help convince people that Emma was still that sweet, innocent girl, that she hadn't meant to do it, that there had been some misunderstanding. Or maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized what I had known all along. That Emma wasn't who she thought she was. That she never had been. I let the message sit there, unplayed again for days. I carried my phone with me, feeling the weight of her voice in my pocket, knowing that I had a decision to make. I had spent my whole life wanting her to call me, to reach out, to say she loved me, that she was sorry, that she wanted me to come home. But now, faced with the moment I had dreamed of, I realized something. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to be a part of that world anymore. A world where my worth was measured against Emma's lies. Where my love was something to be discarded the moment it became inconvenient. I wasn't the same girl who had walked out that night, desperate and lost. I had built something for myself, and even if it wasn't much, it was real. It was mine. So I made my choice. I deleted the message. I didn't respond. And just like that, I was free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my mother's approval. I wasn't hoping for Emma's downfall. I wasn't clinging to the past, wishing it had been different. I was simply moving forward. And that was the best decision I had ever made.